your video off. Great. Sorry, I'm Remy Shogel, and thank you so much for coming today to our latest Healthy Conversation. We're discussing sustainable, productive and resilient food systems for Australia. And a huge thank you to the CSIRO, Erin and Frank, for being with us, and Nat Stapleton from Dietitians Australia for joining us as well. Before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm calling from Wurundjeri country in Naarm, or so-called Melbourne today. I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. At CAHA, we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and on which people across this land called Australia work. We commit to listening to and learning from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' ways of being and knowing, and hope we can reflect that better in our work. So I would encourage all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat, say where you're from, say what country you're calling in from, and also, you know, are you a food expert or are you new to food? I'm sort of the newbie on this panel as someone who's curiously learning all these new bits of information about how climate change, health and our food systems intersect. And I'm really lucky to have these experts with us today. And just while we're presenting, if you could keep your speakers on mute, feel free to put questions and comments in the chat. We've got our lovely policy and advocacy specialist, Chelsea Honeysett, responding in there as well. So a big thank you to our people joining today, and we're going to be talking through the Reshaping Australian Food Systems roadmap and having a bit of a discussion after. I'm going to throw it to Nat for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thanks, Remy. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here today. I'm the General Manager of the Policy and Advocacy team at Dietitians Australia. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the land upon which we all meet today. For myself today, I am dialing in from a very wet Wollongong, Dharawal country, a continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I also extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. Dietitians Australia is a member of CAHA, and we're also the national body for the dietetic professionals in Australia. We have over 8,500 members across the country and overseas, and our vision is to be the leading voice in nutrition and dietetics. Today, I'm just going to quickly touch on a bit of the work we've been doing in this space and also provide a few quick comments around some of the broader policy initiatives that are underway at the moment. So our organisation actually published a position statement last year in nutrition and dietetics on healthy and sustainable diets. In this position statement, you'll see that it's the position of our organisation that to promote both human and planetary health, a food system transformation is needed that enables the population to adopt healthy and sustainable diet-related practices. For us, a healthy and sustainable diet must, firstly, be nutritionally adequate, healthy and safe. Secondly, must have low environmental impact and be protective of natural resources and biodiversity. Thirdly, must be culturally acceptable, and finally must be accessible, economically fair and affordable. We acknowledge that it is critical to prioritise Indigenous knowledges in consultation, policy making and implementation processes to achieve these recommendations. So what is the specific role that dietitians can play in this space? Dietitians are critical to achieving food system transformations and in particular have an important role in driving a population-wide shift to healthy and sustainable diets. Dietitians can support this shift through food-based dietary guidelines at a population level, food procurement and menu planning policies at an institutional level, product reformulation within the private food industry, as well as nutrition education and medical nutrition therapy level at groups and community levels. This work of dietitians is essential to nourish present and future generations within planetary boundaries. The position paper we released last year had 4 main policy recommendations that were prioritised based on our expertise and capacity to influence action. These were firstly, the development of a comprehensively and adequately resourced national nutrition strategy. Secondly, the integration of sustainability principles within the dietary guidelines. Thirdly, the reorientation of our food environment to prioritise not only healthy but sustainable food options. And fourthly, investing in the capacity building for the dietetic profession. Our position statement has been critical to underpinning much of the policy and advocacy work we undertake as an organisation. There are a number of activities happening in the broader policy landscape at present where all of us on the line can continue to be advocating for healthy and sustainable diets. The first area is a national food and nutrition policy. Did many of you know the last one we had was in 1992? I think we all know, though, that food and nutrition has changed a lot in the last 3 decades. Currently, there's work underway under the National Preventative Health Strategy budget to develop a framework for a national nutrition policy. We're awaiting some more updates on this work, and alongside our allies, we'll continue to advocate for the development and fully funded implementation of a national nutrition policy. The other key area we can all be really interested in at the moment is the update of the 2013 dietary guidelines. The recent progress updates published by the NHMRC highlight that sustainable diets have been identified as very high priority. They will, however, be addressed by a separate but concurrent process due to the breadth of specialist expertise required. As an organisation, we're really looking forward to continuing to work with many of you to achieve a food system transformation that enables the population to adopt healthy and sustainable dietary practices. Thanks, Remy.
Thanks, Nat, and thank you to Dietitians Australia for your ongoing membership of the Climate and Health Alliance. I'm now handing over to Erin and Frank from the CSIRO. A really quick introduction. Frank Sperling is a leader in food system transformation and heads up Food System Horizons, which is a joint think tank between CSIRO and the University of Queensland. And the think tank seeks to strengthen the capacity of our food systems to deliver food and nutritional security while being sustainable, fair, resilient, and economically viable. And my pleasure as well to introduce Erin McClure, who is a consultant at CSIRO Futures, who led on the development of this roadmap. Thanks so much, guys. And you should be able to share screen now.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Romy, for those very kind introductions, and also Nat for your intro just then. We really do appreciate the input and contributions of all of the stakeholders into our report, including Dietitians Australia, obviously. And I'll just share my screen now. Is that projecting properly?
Yeah, looks good.
Beautiful. Thank you. Great. So yeah, welcome everyone again to this briefing for the Reshaping Australian Food Systems roadmap. We really do appreciate everyone taking the time to come today and are very pleased to see such a big turnout. So the purpose of these briefings really is to provide an overview of the project, including our processes as well as our findings. And we want to leave enough time at the end, obviously, for a Q&A to really discuss those next steps and driving forward change. So before we get started, I'd also first just like to acknowledge the Bunurong people as the traditional owners of the land from which I'm presenting on today in Clayton, Victoria, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And would also like to acknowledge the Turrbal and the Jagera people as the traditional owners of the land from the St Lucia area in Queensland, which is where Frank is located on today. So just quickly, I'd like to just go into a little bit more of an introduction here and introduce ourselves and the team for those that don't know who we are. So the report was actually led by a small team within CSIRO called CSIRO Futures, and we're the strategic and economic consulting arm of CSIRO, and we work quite closely with our research leaders to deliver both commercial and confidence projects, as well as public-facing reports that address national challenges and enable industry development. So you'll see on the screen here some of the reports that we've published over the last few years, and these are the ones with a specific focus on the agri-food system. And as Remy so kindly noted before, I'm also joined by Frank, who's a senior principal research scientist at CSIRO, and he's engaged in a range of initiatives that focus on food system transformation, as well as being director of the Food System Horizons initiative, which was that joint think tank. So we'll touch more on the Food System Horizons and his other endeavours later on, but we really do just want to note that we do see the initiative as a valuable mechanism in driving forward next steps. So in terms of today's agenda, we'll start by giving an overview of the project, including its objectives, stakeholder engagements, methodology and structure, and then we'll go into discuss some of the key findings and some of the high-level takeaways from the project as well. And then we'll discuss next steps and leave plenty of time for that Q&A at the end there. So just touching on the objectives of the report, which was to ultimately determine the science, technology, systems and infrastructure required to support Australian food systems and create a more sustainable, equitable and healthy future for Australian agriculture, food, the environment and people. So it's quite a broad scope, as I'm sure you can imagine. And the roadmap was really designed to be a guide for decision makers, highlighting some of the key changes that could shift Australia's trajectory to reach this future. And it does that by articulating global aspirations and challenges as they present themselves in a national context, and by taking a systems lens to build awareness of some of the potential synergies as well as trade-offs within Australia's food system. We were fortunate to partner with a number of organisations on this project, and they include federal government departments and agencies, state governments, and some industry partners as well. And these organisations ultimately formed our steering committee. So in more detail, these partners were the Department of Ag, Forestry and Fisheries, the Federal Department of Health and Aged Care, Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, FSANZ, the Tasmanian and Queensland state governments, Vic Health, Food Bank, the Australian Institute of Packaging, and Austrade. And now getting into some of the meatier stuff around our methodology, I suppose. There was quite a lot of various elements that really did form this quite robust methodology. So we started by undertaking desktop research to really leverage on and build upon some of the reports that have already been published in the public domain, both in Australia and internationally as well. So in Australia, we found that there were relatively few reports that do take on that whole of systems lens, but many that covered various elements of the system. And there were also lots of reports and literature that did take that lens, but not necessarily in Australian context, and they more focused on different regions of the world or perhaps globally. Our desktop research was complemented by targeted stakeholder consultations, including consultation with government, industry, researchers, the civil sector, and I'll go a little bit into more detail around that shortly. And also on the left-hand side of the screen there, you'll also see the cover of our discussion paper that was released in December 2022. And that discussion paper summarised the key findings of our initial consultation and used them to articulate both the 2030 target and 2050 vision across 5 focus areas, as well as initial opportunities, recommendations, and R&D priorities. So from that, I'm sure you can imagine it was quite a consultative process. And in total, we conducted consultations with over 90 individuals across 60 organisations. And this included several international food standards and safety agencies as well. We also presented the project at several stakeholder forums that included representatives across the entire food system, including again those from industry, government jurisdictions and consumer health. And in these forums, we estimated that we presented and discussed the project and held Q&As with over 55 organisations as part of that process. And from the discussion paper alone, we received over 54 responses and pulled out over 800 individual actionable feedback comments that were used to inform report development. In the early pages of the report, you can see the organisations that consented to being named. But some of those sectors that we have engaged with are shown in that bubble on the right of the slide there. So quite a broad and good breadth, I'd like to say, of the organisations that we tried to engage with. And as well as engaging externally, we also engaged internally to learn about the state of the art in food science and research and really understand what technology options are on the horizon. And that entailed holding interviews with over 30 CSIRO researchers as well. So before running through the roadmap findings, I'd also just like to touch on the report structure. So our project sought to fill that gap that I mentioned earlier, that was the distinctive lack of literature, I suppose, in the food system space that took that food systems lens in a national context. So our report provided this context by outlining the global imperative for change in the international context in which Australia's food system exists. And this included references to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, as well as Australia's net zero commitments under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It also discussed Australia's national challenges, such as food and water security, dietary risks, supply chain limitations and disruptions, skill and labour shortages and waste. And it really did seek to evolve systems thinking and trade-offs, calling for system-wide change processes to create a more sustainable and equitable food system. So with this in mind, the body of the report was then separated into 5 focus areas to really anchor those findings. So just going through those now, these focus areas were enabling equitable access to healthy and sustainable diets, minimising waste and improving circularity across the system, facilitating Australia's transition to net zero emissions, aligning resilience with socio-economic and environmental sustainability, and increasing value and productivity. So for each of these focus areas, context was provided by consolidating existing and developing new data indicators and providing an overview of actions to date in addressing these respective challenges. And the 2030 targets and 2050 goals, opportunities, and R&D priorities from the earlier mentioned discussion paper were slowly massaged and refined into the final versions that were found in the report today. We also identified a series of entry points for targeted actions that can also be found in the supplementary materials that sit alongside this report. So the project also drew out a number of high-level takeaways from across the system. And given CAHA's role as an organisation, I'm sure that the messages are probably not new information to you all. However, I think they are important concepts to reiterate. So I'll just quickly go over some of these high-level insights now before getting into some of the more granular findings from the report. So the first key, sorry about the slide there, seems to be some overlap, but the first key message from the project is that while Australia's food systems do generally provide safe, high quality and nutritious food to consumers, they do not feed all Australians equitably or sustainably. So on the slide here are just some of the metrics that we collected during the project that exemplify the impact of Australia's food systems on our populations. And aligning with the definition, Food Bank Australia has determined that 33% of Australians experienced either severe or moderate food insecurity in 2022, primarily attributed to low incomes and high living expenses. But we also acknowledge how progressive global warming is also altering average climatic conditions and exposure to extreme events, which not only impact upon food production yields, but also food access and distribution. And we also know that 9 in 10 adults don't meet the recommendations for daily vegetable consumption, and 1 in 2 adults don't meet the daily recommendation for fruit. And alongside this, we're also seeing the proliferation of energy dense but nutritionally poor foods, with these diets contributing to growing burdens on the healthcare system through increased incidence of non-communicable diseases. Adjacent to this point is our second key message that while Australia's food systems have demonstrated the capacity to navigate various risks and stresses and provide most Australians, not all, as we just mentioned, with safe and nutritious food, a growing number of challenges are revealing that there is a need for sustainability transformation if we are to provide for current and future generations. So again, some of these metrics were collected throughout the project and they are shown here. And they do demonstrate some rather concerning trends and data points. So between the erosion and degradation of Australia's productive landscapes, as well as extreme climate events that are increasing in frequency and severity, depletion of natural resources, declining workforces, outdated infrastructure, and the proliferation of food and packaging waste, Australia's food systems, this is just simply not sustainable. And while we acknowledge that Australia's food systems have always had to manage climate and other risks, we also recognise that the impact and interplay of these growing uncertainties have become more complex, and in light of this, new approaches and new solutions are needed. And this leads into the next key message, that Australia's food system is incredibly complex, and therefore challenges and solutions cannot exist in isolation. The diagram on this slide here is highly simplified. However, it is useful in demonstrating some of the interconnections between various parts of the food system and broader networks. For example, noting the interlinkages of the food system with health systems and the challenges such as climate change, and also useful for noting that other challenges such as climate change will become increasingly important to deliver for food system change and driving the need for mitigation and adaptation strategies. With this in mind, it's easy to see how actions in one area may create synergies or trade-offs with other elements or stakeholders within food systems, and this needs to be taken into account when developing and implementing solutions. And to identify these linkages and develop solutions, vast collaboration, shared value, and mutual understanding across a range of stakeholders will be required. While building consensus on particular actions will be difficult and a near impossible task, so I'm sure you can all imagine, there is an opportunity to build consensus around a shared vision and the values that should govern these change processes. But doing so does require conversations across government, industry, and the broader community, and a systems approach. And the last key message that I'll touch on now is just that there is a need for improved consistency and consolidation of data to accurately identify challenges and inform strategic decisions moving forward. So digitalisation was noted across each of the focus areas within identified opportunities and more granular R&D priorities. And a broad suite of technologies and systems will be vital for creating a modernised and advanced food system in Australia. In particular, technologies or systems that provide optionality, a multi-purpose or a cross-cutting across several sectors or industries will be important in managing risks and driving forward change. However, this also does bring with it challenges around digital literacy and accessibility that must also be considered. So in addition to these high-level takeaways, there are also a number of granular insights that were synthesized as part of the project. So I'll go through each of these focus areas now and to discuss the opportunities and R&D priorities. But given how many there were in the project, I'm just going to talk through these nearly from a theme level, although more of the detailed, I guess, opportunities and R&D priorities are provided on the slides. So in our report, we identified 6 opportunities for the Australian food system to better enable equitable access to healthy diets across the value chain. So as I mentioned, I won't go through all of these now, but generally the opportunities fit into themes around food choices, food access, and leveraging system mechanisms for change. We also identified 5 R&D priorities, and among other aspects, these featured the need for behaviour change tools and approaches, systems research that balance the ecological, health, social and economic goals, integrated data platforms to support a range of outcomes, such as better understanding food security and nutrition, or to better inform cost-efficient food testing, authenticity and monitoring. So 3 opportunities were identified to support the minimisation of waste and improvements in circularity. And these looked at packaging, consumer education and waste transformation. And to support these efforts, we identified 6 R&D priorities. And broadly, these included the need to investigate assessment methods that take into account the full costs of food production or packaging use, waste mapping, as well as the development of novel sustainable packaging, waste and value-adding solutions. So 7 opportunities were identified to facilitate Australia's transition to net zero emissions. And these broadly fell into the buckets of technology adoption, sustainable foods, and again, system mechanisms. So here, 8 R&D priorities were identified with themes of improved land management, technologically enabled emissions reduction in ag and food production, sorry, I'll get rid of that one there, and greenhouse gas measurement tools. Investigating the effectiveness and optimization of sustainability labelling and carbon markets were also noted. For aligning resilience with socioeconomic and environmental sustainability, 6 opportunities were identified across the themes of technology adoption, skills and capacity development, and diversification. So 9 R&D priorities were included in areas such as farming practices, digitally and technologically enabled process optimization in a range of applications, and market-based or financing approaches to improve business resilience. And finally, to increase value and productivity, 5 opportunities were identified encompassing exports, industry development, and building productive capacity. 7 R&D priorities were also featured, many including digitalisation as a key feature to improve and grow market access and optimise processes, including resource management, as well as the development of new sustainable and healthy food products and ingredients, and the platforms that are going to be required to create them. So I'm just worried that I've probably bombarded you with a bunch of information now, but I hope that does give you, I guess, a broad understanding of the project and our objectives and how we got to the final product that's now available online. So now I'm just going to invite Frank, who's been an integral member of our project team, to say a few words and also offer additional perspectives on contextualising the roadmap before delving into the Q&A portion of this session. Frank, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Lily. Erin, fantastic to have this overview that you've just given of the process. And I will just add a few points. I mean, it's really exciting to speak with you. You have such a broad range of professionals and expertise represented here, is also visible in the chat. And I wanted to speak a little bit to the context of why now. Maybe if you can put up the questions in a moment as well, Erin, that'd be great. I mean, there's globally, if we look at if we take the international perspective, there's a massive recognition and drive towards food system transformation, recognizing that food systems sit at the nexus of natural and human systems, right? Interacting closely with other systems such as the health and energy system. And if we really want to make progress towards sustainable development and have a chance to getting closer to the sustainable development goals, the food system transformation will play a critical role. We just had in July the United Nations Food Systems Summit +2, so the 2-yearly stock.
Is that just me or is that Frank? He's paused.
I think he's cut out a little bit.
Okay, wasn't sure if it was just me. We'll just give him 10 more seconds. Thanks, guys. Resilient digital infrastructure needed. Agreed, Stefan. Okay, well, while we wait for Frank to come back, Erin, I'll just ask you, we've just had people who are just really excited to be listening and not necessarily taking all the notes. I just wanted to check with you whether these slides will be available for people after. We will be sending around the recording, but it might be helpful for others to just have a closer look at the slides.
Yeah, more than happy to send these to you and you can distribute them however you see fit among the group that's here today. Yeah, can certainly provide those to you after the session.
Yeah, awesome. And are print versions of the roadmap available?
Printed versions, like hard copies?
Yeah.
We do have a small, we tried to keep the print number small just for sustainability reasons.
Yes,
obviously everyone's pivoting towards online versions. So they're certainly available online. We could organise a print run if you guys were interested. We do have a very small number available, certainly not enough for everyone in this call today, but we could organise that if that is something you'd be interested in.
No problem. Okay, well, dear Frank has not rejoined us yet, so we might just move ahead with some of the questions and come back to him when he comes back. Are you comfortable tackling the questions now?
Yeah, can certainly, yeah. I mean, obviously was very heavily involved with the drafting of the report, so I think I should be well versed to answer most of them. Obviously, Frank just brings that academic perspective to this that I might not necessarily have. We do have some guiding discussion questions, as you can see on the slide here, but happy to also follow your lead if anyone's got some other pressing questions that do differ to obviously what's on the slide. Oh,
I'm so sorry, the slide has actually fallen off. If you want to reshare it, that would be great. But I might also, I've got a starting question here from Damien at the George Institute for Global Health. Damien, I'm wondering if you are here and could unmute yourself.
Thanks, Remy. And thanks, Erin, as well for the presentation, and congratulations on completing this absolutely massive piece of work.
Thank you.
On the diet and nutrition side of things, so it's really good to see the report calls for equity and sustainability to be included in the review of Australian dietary guidelines. I have a couple of questions, but I particularly wanted to ask about one of the opportunities listed, which is, just let me pull it up, opportunity for government and business collaboration to reshape commercial food environments. I suppose there's plenty of evidence, as well as decades of first-hand experience, not mine, that the involvement of the unhealthy food industry in policies and programs to improve food environments really tends to undermine their effectiveness. So I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on conflicts of interest and the potential for the unhealthy and ultra-processed food industry to delay meaningful action to protect the community from the disease and the early death caused by their products. I suppose where I'm coming from is that what we really need is the industry to reduce the manufacturing, promotion, the marketing of unhealthy products, which we haven't really seen them commit to. Rather, there's profit from causing harm.
Yes, that is a brilliant question. Thank you so much, Damien. Yeah, what I will say just to preface this conversation is that obviously CSIRO is meant to act as an impartial body. So when it comes to policy discussions, obviously we don't like to put a big policy stance out there, which is usually where a lot of these discussions lead. So we'll just preface by saying that. But obviously it's a massive challenge to the industry and just consumer diets in general. I think it really does come from nearly that grassroots policy advisory approach, where it's really, we do need to bring industry obviously along for the ride and have them make the changes in their factories, in the foods they're producing and in the marketing of them. But obviously that does come with vested interests, which does make it a very, very tricky space to operate in. Would be really interested if you guys have any specific thoughts and actions that could help mitigate some of those vested interests and nearly the steamrolling that can happen in some of those policy rooms, because it is a really, really tricky space to try and navigate. But yeah, what I will say is that we do need to work with industry as much as we kind of need to work against them in this sense, which is a really tricky area to work in, and not something that I necessarily have all of the answers for there. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't really have too much of a concrete answer for that one, but it is a good question. I think a lot of ways forward do involve these conversations that we're having, and obviously working with both on a local level, at a state level, and within federal governments where you do have the opportunity to leverage some of those mechanisms to have these conversations and potentially get bigger industry players on our side, so that obviously that trickles down into some of the smaller spaces as well. Yes, I'm sorry, that's not a very concrete answer, but it is a very tricky space to speak to, especially as a CSIRO representative.
Yeah, no, I absolutely understand. Yeah, and it is nice to hear you acknowledge some of the issues there. I suppose there's a lot of work being done, not just in Australia but around the world, on how to kind of minimise or mitigate, I suppose, the impact that the unhealthy food industry can have in these kinds of policy deliberations as well. So there's plenty of stuff out there.
I might just ask Frank. Frank's back. Frank, I'll throw it back to you for your thoughts that got interrupted before. But did you hear Damien's question? Do you have any response to that?
No, unfortunately, I didn't. I mean, my apologies to the audience. My audio camera obviously froze, and I was presenting on the UN Food Systems Summit stocktake in the international context, and then I realized when I asked Erin, can you please put the presentation on? Everything was frozen.
Oh dear, yeah.
So yeah, I sorry, I'm missing that. So please, if you can just give me a quick context, then I'm happy to chip in. And I'm also happy to give a bit more context on the international stage if that didn't transmit. I don't know where I broke off.
Yeah, well, yeah, sure, Damien, if you want to just ask Frank's thoughts, and then we'll quickly go back to Frank for just a little finish off of his thoughts, and we'll go back to the other questions. I'm acknowledging how many questions there are, so we'll do our best to get to them.
Cool. Thanks, Remy, and thanks, Frank. Yeah, just quickly, I suppose I was asking about the potential for conflicts of interest to undermine conflicts of interest when the food industry works with government, and the potential to undermine some of the healthy and environmentally sustainable kind of outcomes that we're actually looking for. Erin has acknowledged, of course, the difficulties in this area, and that we need to bring industry along for the ride as well.
Yeah,
I suppose acknowledging.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's a food system transformations toward greater sustainability and resilience that involves a great group of stakeholders, and there's of course competing interests and everything. And I think to avoid a conflict of interest or mitigate that, it's important that these stakeholder conversations are balanced and broad. But we need to bring cast the net widely, right? So that we get a really good overview of what are the perspectives, both in terms of enabling transformations, but also holding them back, so that we understand where is maybe common ground on moving forward and how we can then build momentum collectively. And it is important to flag also the potential trade-offs and discuss how we can mitigate them best, right? There's, of course, clearly trade-offs embedded in a transformation process. We need to make sure that these transitions that need to happen are equitable and just and well managed. But at the same time, there's also opportunities and synergies that can be harnessed. I mean, there's global reports that have highlighted there's a massive economic crisis to be had if we implement these transformations of the food system. And I think for Australia, which has also an international food outlook of its food system, it's very important to recognize that also in that space. So we need to bring industry into that conversation, but it needs to be a balanced conversation with diversity of stakeholders. I hope that somewhat answers your question.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks. Frank, I'll give you an opportunity to finish what you were saying before. Sorry that we lost you. And then I'll go back to the Q&A.
Yes. Did you hear anything I said about the United Nations Food Systems Summit?
I think you're about halfway through that point when it cut off. So feel free to start from the beginning there, Frank.
Okay. So, I mean, the food system per se plays a very special role because it sits right at the nexus between natural and human systems, right? And we are at the moment also coming out of the pandemic and all these other crisis events that are happening, falling short on making progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So the transformation of the food system is recognized as critical on making global progress and addressing also the rising levels of poverty and food insecurity we're seeing, but also tackling the other health challenges that are embedded currently in the food system and which Erin spoke to in the national context, while at the same time also preparing for global environmental change and the changing risk factors that come with that. So the United Nations Food Systems Summit and the stock take that just happened in July, so there's a 2-yearly stock take taking place, showed that 120 plus countries have already submitted national pathways for food system transformation. So there's a considerable momentum internationally on rethinking of food system governance, how we approach food systems in our policies and practice environment. And in that space, given that Australia's food system is also international oriented, there's also an opportunity, right? How do we position Australia food system in this context and see also opportunities on helping manage global challenges collectively? And then we need to, at the same time, acknowledge also, with global temperatures being off the chart, ocean temperatures being off the chart, we're seeing these extreme events happening around the globe with an increasing risk with rising temperatures of multiple breadbasket failures. How do we manage this global risks better within, and what role does Australia have to play in this? While at the same time, how do we manage the risks that are impacting on Australia's food systems at home? So this resilience and sustainability focus, and there's massive momentum, and we should seize this momentum. And in a way, the roadmap is a contribution to that and helping to provide a starting point for the dialogue and seeing what kind of vision of Australia's food system we want to take forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Frank, and thanks everyone for sticking with us. I'm going to pick up some of the awesome questions which have been coming through in the Q&A now. Erin, I've also asked people if they've got thoughts on those Q&A discussion questions to feel free to put them in the chat, and we can share that after the webinar. I'm going to go straight to a pretty bold question from Kelly Williams. Keen to hear if there'll be a bold addressing of the elephant in the food room, the overproduction and overconsumption of meat, unsustainable in the face of climate change and increasing environmental impacts and contributing to bowel cancer. Thoughts? And I'd also just like to re-welcome back Nat Stapleton. If you'd like to respond to any of these questions, also feel free.
Frank, did you want to kick off, or did you want me to jump in?
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go at it. I mean, again, behavioral change and is well recognized as one important aspect of food system transformation. And the Eat Lancet diet is one example which illustrated that shifting to more healthy diets has not only individual benefits for us and for our welfare, but also has planetary benefits by shifting and changing the consumption patterns of populations. Obviously, that has to be contextualized and well managed, and we need to at the same time think how, in the production space, how we can maybe through precision agriculture to better farming methods, better livestock rearing, we can also change the footprint from that angle as well. But yes, diets can play a critical role in not only improving our health personally, but also managing our footprint globally, well recognized.
And I think in the report, we didn't necessarily make any bold statements such as saying that everyone in Australia should automatically shift away from eating any form of animal products full stop. I think our stance that we really took on the project was that there are so many opportunities that we have to change those behaviours, and so many different avenues in the ways that we do it. So obviously, in terms of crop production, there's so many opportunities to make our crops more resilient or increase productivity yields so that we can feed more people on the lands that we are using for food production. But there are also a number of novel technology and production platforms such as precision fermentation, such as Frank just mentioned. And as those production platforms scale up and we can make more food products and increase capacity that way, obviously we can feed more people in a more sustainable manner through those mechanisms and avenues. But also we do recognise that obviously a big cultural thing in Australia is that our farmers are our backbone. And I think the minute that you mention moving away from meat full stop, it does get a lot of people, obviously, it gets their backs up, and people are really concerned about the future of Australia. So in that sense, I don't think it's something that we can say, no Australians should eat meat. It's not practical, it's not feasible, and quite frankly, I think it would get that much pushback. But what we can do is make our industries more sustainable, and there's so many opportunities within meat production and general agricultural practices that can reduce emissions, and that could allow us and Australians to be more sustainable in the foods that we're eating without necessarily changing as many of those behaviours at a consumer end. Like if they're done before the foods get to the supermarket, it makes it easier on a consumer just to go in and buy what they normally would. But obviously the emissions or environmental impacts associated with that could be far reduced and far less. And I think that's the other important element of the puzzle there as well.
Thanks, Erin. Anything you'd like to add, Nat?
No, nothing extra, Remy. I think it's really around there's a lot of changes we can make in our population diet to improve both the health and sustainability of the way our population eats in general.
If I can maybe add to this, I think a lot of it has to do also with opportunities in education, right? So you need to, food needs to be affordable so that you can make these choices. It has to do with the food environment. How is it presented? What education is linked to it? So yeah, it needs to be a multi-pronged approach, and I think we need to also make sure that you bring along a critical mass, right? So it doesn't help if a small minority implements radical changes, but the rest doesn't come along. So this is why that goes back to the earlier conversation. It really needs to be a broad stakeholder conversation so that we understand really what are the critical barriers and enablers across, so that we make a leap forward towards more resilient and sustainable food systems.
Thanks so much. We'll move on. Question from Amy Carrad. How is first food security included? So we're talking about breastfeeding, etc.
To be completely honest, it wasn't omitted from our report, but it wasn't necessarily the focus that we took. I think a lot of that does come down to obviously personal decisions around what mothers and people that identify as mothers want to make with respect to that. So yeah, it's not something that we touched on too heavily. Obviously, we understand the importance of breastfeeding and the nutrients that are passed on in that way, but we also do recognise that in some cases, obviously, formula is a necessary thing, and it does exist for a reason, and that some people don't have the capacity to breastfeed, especially in the quantities that are required. So yeah, it's not something that we touched on too much in the report. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add there, Frank, but we do understand that it is an important piece of the puzzle as well. Yeah, just something we're probably not the most well versed in responding to.
Thanks, Erin. I know Andrea Schmidtke is on this call, and does a lot of work in this area. If you want to jump in, Andrea, and add anything to.
Hi, Chelsea, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the really interesting presentations. I am interested in how this does seem to focus, sort of a little bit going back to Damien's point on how industry can step up, and that sort of is included by omitting things like recommendations around breastfeeding and things like that. There is a real need for there to be a better framework from government and government-led, so that these things are left less in industry's hands. And the report doesn't really go to how that government action should be taken in any detail. Is there any reason why there wasn't more structure around the government role?
So something the report tried to do was, I guess, make hints or discuss that at a very high level. Just as CSIRO's role, we're not really privy to making very clear recommendations to government. You know, we are a public-private organisation, and it can be perceived as lobbying, which is a bit of a dicey territory to get into. So yeah, that's the main reason why that we don't touch on very discrete government actions and what we think that they could be doing. So, but what we do instead is obviously err on the side of evidence-based insights that we do garner. And I'm not sure if you've had a chance to pick up the supplementary materials, but within there we do have those action areas, which does go into key themes. It breaks our recommendations down into key themes and suggests what entities would perhaps be best placed to pick up some of those and roles in a bit more detail than what the main body of the report does. I think the main body of the report, you can see it's quite lengthy and context heavy, and it really was to provide that overview and bring all of those linkages and synergies and trade-offs together in a way that hasn't necessarily done before. But the follow-up actions, yeah, we've tried to separate out into that separate document and yeah, break them out in that sense, if that makes, yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit. Frank, did you have anything else there to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, just to add, I mean, we're not policy prescriptive here, right? So the report, what it does, it draws out a range of perspectives and entry points and organizes them along these 5 focal areas. There's obviously an opportunity to analyze several of these recommendations more deeply and look at also cross relationships more in future analysis. As we've pointed out, there is, you know, you need to look at, you know, if you implement certain recommendations, what are the impact pathways possibly across the system? What does that mean in practice? The report gives you an entry point for looking at what are, by the stakeholders consultations, what were identified as opportunities, building a more systemic focus on how we produce and consume food. But obviously, this is not something that you can conclude with one report. This has to be a continuous effort, and it requires also addressing linkages across systems, as I wanted to highlight my earlier question to you. I don't know if you've discussed it, between health and food and so on, and also energy systems, among others.
Thanks for that. Look, I appreciate that there's I mean, it's an enormous document. There's a huge amount of work gone into synthesizing many views and trying to bring that together. I think it's really hard for organisations like CSIRO who are not policy prescriptive. When a document like this comes out, there is a risk that this will be relied on for a way forward in relation to this transformation. And it does heavily rely on consumers making changes to their behaviours and industry stepping up. And the evidence actually shows that that's not necessarily the best way to have those changes happen. So I think there's a little bit of caution that needs to be taken in highlighting some of those things as the best way forward.
What would you recommend? I mean, just bouncing off your comment here, what do you think should have come out more? What in terms of making change happen?
Definitely more clear guidance around the
moving this
need for
forward, in your
reduction
opinion?
of commercially produced foods and ultra-processed foods, rather than consumers choosing our healthy choices. There needs to be actually a real shift in the food environment that we live in. There need to be less of those foods available. The marketing on them needs to be restricted. We need to say better labeling of them. And we're not seeing some of those really key things that we know the evidence is suggesting as best practice for shifting food environments for health. And also that would have benefits for the environment coming through in that report in the way that we had hoped.
Mm-hmm.
We do, yeah, I do hear that, and I do appreciate, the comment, Andrea, and it's something that we do grapple with quite a lot, and especially with reports in this space. It is, like I said, a very tricky territory to navigate, and I'm very sorry that, obviously those things didn't come out as much as you would have liked to have seen. What we did try to do is, we did actually talk about a number of those things, but obviously not in a way that says Australia and our governments need to make these actions now, because obviously we can't do that. But what we did do is we identified where they had been done quite well overseas and in international context, and said, hey, here's an example here of where it has worked, and evidence does point to suggest that this could potentially be an opportunity for Australia, and nearly let government read between the lines. So I do agree that we probably weren't quite as prescriptive as we would like to be sometimes, but unfortunately it's just something we have to deal with. But we did try to include all of those discussions as much as possible, and where we could, and try not to omit anything.
I'm going to have to move us on, folks. I do apologise, Frank. I know you were about to say something. We've got a lot of questions, and in fact, we're not going to get to them all. So, but CAHA will do its best to kind of address some of these on our socials in the next few days. I think a really important thing that's come out through a lot of different questions in the chat, a lot of similar questions coming through on the social determinants. Access to safe, healthy and sustainable foods is really underpinned by social determinants which are outside of the health system. Can you speak to what the report recommends when it comes to this score?
Again, it's a very tricky area to, a lot of, obviously, social determinants of health are huge indicators of food insecurity and a lot of the other challenges that we do talk about, and that are facing so many Australians. But a lot of the time, again, there's a lot of interactions with different systems, whether it's education, housing, income, and unfortunately, again, a lot of those do err into the side of policy. We do, in the report, obviously, draw out how important they are and the implications that it does have on people's diets and people's health and people's livelihoods. But yeah, I guess, again, we weren't super prescriptive around changes that do need to happen there, again, because I guess it does fall into that nearly federal or state policy level. Frank, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, what we offer is for one, a snapshot of the state of the system, and it touches on, in all fairness, it touches on several points that were raised earlier, also on the food environment and so on, that play into that. And again, these are, and the opportunities that were then identified, they should not be seen as that this closes the debate. It's exactly what we're doing right now. This should open up the debate. And it's for us, and there's different roles to play. CSIRO can come in from the knowledge generations, the innovation side, and also flagging to CSIRO maybe if is there other knowledge or information that needs to be generated, or knowledge gaps that need to be addressed that researchers could go into. Then there's a policy and I guess you see also an advocacy element that's outside our realm, and that's for other players to take up. But what we can, and hopefully did in the report, and I think to a large extent we succeeded, is give an overview of where some of the key issues lie. And because the system is so complex, there will always be something that's missed. And it's also a consultative exercise, right? It's not a integrated assessment modeling of trade-offs and synergies, which is a different scientific approach. What it tried is to draw out through the debate, to the inputs that were provided in the discussion paper, some of the key issues, and link that to an assessment of the state of the food system and the overall narrative that is presented in the report. So I do recognize that we can't touch up on everything, but in all fairness, I think we've covered a lot of ground on the report.
Thank you. Nat, would you like to add anything about that question or CSIRO's response or the social determinants of health in this area?
No, but I do think it's a really important area that we do address the social determinants because it does impact on a lot of things like food security. I actually just have a question though for Erin and Frank on this fact. So I know that obviously there was a lot of partners from government, and have you had much response from government on the paper since it's been released? Because I know that you're talking today about it's not going to be, you haven't focused on the policy initiatives, for example, but I'm interested to see what the government response has been.
The government response, well, from my perspective, obviously, Frank, you can add to this later, has been largely positive. I think one of the values of having, again, like with our steering committee, we want a diverse array of stakeholders represented in that forum to provide input into the report alongside all of the other stakeholders that we engage with. But one of the real benefits of having, I guess, perhaps the weighting skew a little bit more towards the government side of things is that in terms of driving forward actions or like conversations post-project launch, it means that we already have a range of engaged bodies that want to continue those conversations and can see value in continuing those conversations. So we haven't actually identified any concrete actions yet to move forward with, but I'm sure you can all appreciate that government processes can be quite slow, but we are having those conversations with key stakeholders, and particularly those that were on our steering committee. And yeah, we're having those conversations, one-on-one meetings with specific targeted groups within the specific departments that we've engaged with. So from that perspective, I think, the uptake and interest from those groups has been quite positive. Frank, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, overall, I would say that there is quite a momentum, which is already evident in the national policy debate, that is a much greater push towards greater sustainability and so on, and this having these discourses. And we see it on climate change, the updated NDC. I think I spoke to earlier, and Australia's commitment to net zero. What's the role of the food system within that space? Because the targets are currently economy-wide. Then the roadmap, by engaging different departments at the national and state level and having this as a conversation tool, I think is already helping to make connections across maybe previously more siloed thinking or approaches. And I think we need to further explore on how can we inform and provide knowledge that cuts across, given that we recognize these systems are so interconnected: health, climate, energy, and so on.
Thanks, Frank.
And yeah.
I was just going to say we've got, we've just ticked over into 12. So I'm just going to pass to Chelsea Hunnisett, our policy and advocacy specialist, to wrap up.
Thanks, Romy, and thanks, Erin and Frank. A really great session, really interesting to hear more about the report and kind of see everyone's comments. There's clearly so much interest in this space and so much enthusiasm to make sure that we have a healthy and sustainable food system. And from a CAHA perspective, we're really looking at ramping up this work in the lead up to COP, both in terms of what we can be advocating for on the national level, but also what Australia should be speaking to the international level and through those climate processes. So we've taken all of those comments on board. We're going to reach out to a number of you after this, but please do keep an eye out. We're going to be keeping this conversation going and having more events and policy focused events to really make sure that we're advocating in the way that's supportive for public health. So thank you to everyone. Thanks again to Eric and Frank, and you'll all be hearing from us soon, and don't hesitate to get in touch.
And thank you so much to CAHA for having us today. I will just say I didn't quite get to it on the slides, but our contact details are also available there, and obviously we'll share that with you to circulate amongst the group here. So if anyone does want to get in contact with either Futures or Frank and engage with us that way, we're also always willing to have a conversation and want to move these conversations forward. So thank you again for having us, and hopefully, we can continue to engage in the future.
That's great. I'll send those slides around and the recording, and I have a feeling that there were a lot of questions just because of time we didn't get to, so I'm sure you'll be getting some emails. But awesome to have this space to have this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much for an interesting discussion.
Thank you.